presentation with a beautiful woman at the back of the room, and now he's found his way up. Our keynote speaker this afternoon is Adrian Hunter, the director of the Literal Arts Trust in England, where he works with the UK Department of Culture and Department of Rural Affairs on cultural strategies for the arts in rural areas. Such a program we don't have here. His current area of focus is the development of the first international rural biennale of art, agriculture and environmental sustainability in the UK. Am I correct? So, will you please make him welcome, Ian Hunter?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd just like to say thank you to Marco and to the staff at IASCA for organising this symposium, which is excellent, and also for their hard work in putting together Spaced. It's also a useful opportunity, indeed an important opportunity for me to say a big thank you to Edith Cowan University, because 10 years ago they gave me it was the Australian Bicentennial Commonwealth Visual Arts Fellowship, which I spent 3 months at Edith Cowan as a visiting artist, visiting fellow, and that really was an important experience for me, apart from the fact my sister and gorgeous nieces live in Western Australia, to really begin to look at this whole idea of agriculture and culture, and the notion that the changes in agriculture, both globally and in Australia and in Europe in particular, which I'm going to talk about, raise really important cultural questions. And it seemed to me that the cultural sector, arts councils, art galleries, museums, etc., and most artists, but not all, were not aware of this, and it seemed to be a really important opportunity. The third thing I'd like to say before I start, how delighted I am to see Nalda Searles in the slide presentation. Nalda is a heroine of mine, and indeed a great inspiration on me and many other practitioners, so thank you for that. Kia ora. She actually pioneered a lot of this work a long time ago. So I took a liberty with Marco's title of his conference, because getting emails, getting the invite, like most of you, we're in a hurry, we access our email, we think, and it was always spaced out to me. And, it got into my computer, and it stayed there ever since. Of course, it's a slightly tongue-in-cheek, provocative thing, because, I've been in and out of Australia, and Western Australia for about 10, 12 years, so I know it reasonably well. Spaced out. When I was a child, in school, the teacher would always slap your wrist and say, space out your words, you were learning to write. So the idea was that you had to take your ideas and space them out in order to make sense. I'd like to do that with Marco's proposition for his current biennale and future biennale, because he's identified very cunningly, he's a very cunning person, Marco. He pretends, he's a wonderful person, and, being Irish, we've got a slight insight into how Italians think. I thought, he's up to something, I better, find out what it is. So the bit about rethinking Marxism and the post-agriculture, that's a joke also. I don't know how many of you have been to art history conferences or, art and aesthetics or art and politics. As soon as the word Marxism comes up or rethinking, people just go to sleep. And the post-agricultural era is a serious thing. I'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, this is Subiaco, 1929. And here we have, it's not a very good high-resolution photograph, but I thought I'd like to start with it. The memory of the city has its origins in agriculture. The memory of the city has its origins in agriculture. Think of Mesopotamia, the early civilizations. The word civilization, it was agriculture that gave birth to the city. It was agriculture that gave birth to civilization. And in the work that we're doing in England, which is towards a cultural strategy for agricultural change, we say three things. We make three arguments. First of all, agriculture sits at the heart of culture. Agriculture was the first culture. In Canada, they talk about First Nations. And the third one is agriculture is a cultural responsibility and necessary. So those ideas that we have developed this work in England. Now, I want to specify, it's really, I'm talking in a European context, and particularly in an English context, so it may not be entirely appropriate to Western Australia, but I want to share these with you. Again, picking up Marco's strategy and trying to look underneath it, he really seems to be talking about three things here, and I think they're challenges. I think he's throwing out challenges, he and his team, and indeed the artists have, I think, picked up on those very well. The notion of the rural as a critical site. Agriculture as a site for critical engagement and research, if you like. Inside agriculture, the discourse of rural and agriculture are really important ethical, social, philosophical, and aesthetic challenges, equal and comparable and complementary to the discourse of urbanism, which is what cultural policy and arts policy, and indeed most arts practice, has been engaged with for the last 25 years. That's where public art comes from, it's where community art comes from to a large extent, socially engaged art, etc., and curatorship and biennales, the discourse of urbanism, and how it deliberately or inadvertently masks out, occludes the discourse of agriculture, the radical discourse of the rural, which is really my point in being here today. So rural, social, radical. The rural is a critical site. The notion of a new aesthetic, which would parallel the urban discourse aesthetics of relational art. I'm in flagging up here the notion of a durational aesthetic, durational art practices. And Claire Doherty has already picked up on this, and a number of people have already gone. You had socially engaged art, then you had critical art engagement, then you had relational, then you had dialogical. Now I want to argue we're looking at a durational aesthetic, a set of practices that can be described as durational. Not just taking a long time, they have other dimensions. Here's the problem, as we see it. I'll let you read it. I think it's very informative. Remember, of course, in Russia, in mid-19th century Russia, that in a sense, for people like so Marx was a middle-class urban intellectual, and for him, the peasantry and the dire situation of the peasantry was a deep embarrassment, it was a sense of shame. And in a sense, the discourses of political emancipation, the whole concept of socialism, Marxism, was an urbanist discourse. Didn't intend to be anti-rural, but it's had that effect. I also blame Marx, you can quote me on this, for industrial agriculture. Industrial agriculture. Okay? The industrialization of agriculture. Basically, what I want to suggest to you, and then I will go on and give you examples. What we're talking about here, I think, and why this conference and this project is so important, there's another major project happening in Spain called Campo Adentro, which is using a very similar methodology to IASCA. There's a project in Thailand, and we're working on a biennale type structure. Why? There's a sense that the cultural sector, artists, curators, museums, realize a new discourse is needed. And it's not just about the rural, and it's not just about agriculture, it's about sustainability. So it's a complementary discourse, reconnecting the urban and the rural. Basically, we've got the wrong agriculture. I'm talking now in a European context, particularly in the context of EU agricultural policy, which of course affects rural development. I mean, I'm going to talk mostly about agriculture now and agricultural policy, but I'm also referring to the rural communities and rural development. But the agriculture thing is very interesting because it highlights some of these critical, aesthetic, ethical, and philosophical issues which all artists, all cultural practitioners, I believe, want to get engaged with. The labyrinth and the minotaur, back to early Greek Minoan. I mean, there you've got it, the stockyards in Chicago, in 1890, the labyrinth. And then you go to Wall Street, and you have the bull, okay? What I'm trying to say is this is an archetypal, this is an ancient problem. It's an ancient discourse. The pioneer of art and agriculture, and to my mind, the artist who I think mapped all this territory out 20 years ago, was Agnes Dennis. She's my heroine. I've met her, I've worked with her. I think she's absolutely fantastic. Interesting here also because as I try to elaborate my proposition here is, of course, that Agnes had spotted these ideas quite some time ago. She's from a farming background and sort of recognized three things with this project. But our work also began as a critique of public art, particularly mainstream public art and urbanist discourse, way back in Manchester in the early 80s. And this is Creative Time. Creative Time is getting a really bad press here today. Started this project in Battery Park in the early 80s. It was an infill, and the city said, well, look, we'd like some public sculpture there. And Creative Time ran a whole series of public art projects, temporary public art projects. This is like late 70s, early 80s. Agnes comes along, they commission Agnes because they want her to do a huge phallic piece of sculpture. She says, no, I want to cultivate a wheat field. And some of you may know the project. You can access it on greenmuseum.org. Greenmuseum.org. The whole documentation is there. The guts of it was she knew her wheat farming colleagues were having difficulties. They were getting low prices for wheat. America was dumping wheat in the international market, selling it surplus wheat to Russia. And of course, the futures market in Wall Street had picked up on agricultural futures. You know the rest of the story. Looming in the background, by no accident, are Twin Towers. Basically, having begun to look at this area, and I'm referring back to Marco's agenda here, I want to suggest that really what we're looking at is curating agriculture, reframing agriculture as a cultural discourse. Why? The plan of agriculture, the neoliberal global plan of agriculture is industrialization, mechanization, chemicals, and it's killing us. So reframing the discourse of agriculture as a cultural discourse should allow in other ethical, aesthetic insights and discourses. So I want to propose to Marco that maybe and we've talked about this anyway in an offhand word, a sort of general way, is rethinking curatorships and beyond. That's the art world's model. That's the urban art world's model for effecting, and I love that word, efficacy, effecting cultural change, economic change. Let's rethink curatorship and biennales in the context of a cultural strategy for agriculture. The other element that Marco has flagged up very subtly, but in a very curious way, very, very critically, is the notion of practice, art practice, critical practice. He's problematizing socially engaged art practice. He uses it a lot in his introductory part, but I think he's really, in a very cunning way, in an intelligent way, problematizing it. And I think our colleague from the United States has also very beautifully raised that. There's a deep problem with professional art practice. There is a problem at the heart of socially engaged art practice, where I think it's critically flattened out, and it's got serious, serious internal problems. We've had agony this morning. I'm sorry I missed the presentation. I want to propose ecstasis. Of course, you have the model there for ecstasy, better known as Molly. And I think there's a sense in critical practice where we need to step outside of ourselves, need to step out of our zone of professional privilege to interrogate from the outside ecstasis, but also with ecstasy, with a sense of. So I want to come back to this notion of ecstasy. By the way, the list on the left-hand side is a list of all the experiences that artists have when they're deeply engaged with their practice. Every single one of those you will experience as an artist without taking ecstasy. Problematizing the world, I popped the slide in as completely out of sequence because I also run a conference on the creative rural economy. And one of the things I love to do, because Richard Florida and the creative economy, it's really not orthodoxy and urban practice, but there is a feral, subversive, dangerous dimension to the creative rural economy. And of course, on the left-hand side, I don't know if you know myths. I was in Iowa a year ago, and they drove me through the Corn Belt, and it was a conference. They said, that farmer's in prison, That farmer's in prison. That farmer. I said, what for? Oh, methods. Converting fertilizer into methods. And of course, it's a long tradition. The rural is not a pussycat. It's dangerous. Okay, the real point I want to make here is those are the conclusions we've come to, or I've come to, after about 10 years' work in this field. They're not quite formed yet, but they're getting there. And really where they've got, so back on the farm, oh, by the way, I grew up on a farm in Ireland, which has a lot to do with why I have an affinity for agriculture, cow shit, and sheep. Really what we've been working on now in England for the last 10 years is a cultural strategy for rural communities. And inside that is also the proposition of art and agriculture as a new critical genre. And those two elements will contribute, we hope, towards a cultural strategy for European agriculture and rural development policy post-CAP. Common Agricultural Policy is up for review in 2013. That's the agenda. Right-hand slide, the EU Parliament celebrating their 50th anniversary, 50th anniversary of the CAP. The CAP, Common Agriculture Programme, takes up 48% of the EU total budget. That is zillions. Why? Because the French and the Germans want to protect their farmers. That's a very controversial statement, by the way. And so what we've tried to do is really working with using existing arts development and arts policy to develop the basis of a cultural intervention into European agricultural policy. And I think the kind of case studies we're seeing here today are evidence of this growing field of practice amongst artists and curators. The origin of the test project for us was Art Barns in 1999. Very briefly, with the introduction of the Common Agricultural Policy reform, small farmers, family farmers, those important cultural diversity of agriculture are being squeezed out. And one of the casualties were hill farmers, certainly hill farmers in the United Kingdom, Scotland, England, Wales. They're mostly tenant farmers. For example, over 60% of the tenant farmers are the tenants of the 8 most wealthiest people in Europe, the Duke of Westminster and all of that. So it's a very feudal system. Anyway, we talked with the hill farmers and said, look, could we do a project with you? I was interested in what was happening. And this was when the Arts Council was bringing in a massive new lottery arts program. So we said to the Arts Council, could we do a project about hill farming and agriculture? And they said instantly no. I said, why? I said, well, we don't do agriculture. It's nothing to do with cultural policy or arts strategy. They actually said that. So we went away and said, well, look, if we could come back with a precedent, a cultural plea, would you let us do the project with the farmers? And they said, yeah. Well, Curators, the pioneer data artist, came as a refugee to England in 1940, made one of his key Merzbaus in a barn. And of course, Zaha Hadid, Rem Koolhaas, so you just list all those artists, they worship. So we went back to the Arts Council and said, well, Curators did it, can we? They said, okay. They gave us some money. It was very much a similar methodology to Spaced, but we took farms, emptied farm barns, and artists worked with the farmers over an extended period of time. The project actually was really looking at economic, social, and environmental outcomes, not necessarily artistic. After we finished Art Barns, the Arts Council said, well, look, this is very interesting. We didn't realize that artists could work with farmers and it could be successful. We said, well, yes. 6 months later, the headlines opened up with BSE. Something's wrong with the cows. And I think you know the rest of the story. It was a disaster. Again, this problem of the wrong agricultural policy. Something like £8 billion was wiped off the value of British livestock. The farming industry went into crisis, and 190 people died, the most excruciatingly painful and awful and wasting disease. There's no cure for it. The problem was the government relaxed the guidelines on veterinary care and industrial production of animal feedstocks. They were feeding hen shit, diseased sheep into the food chain, ended up in the cattle. BSE has come back to us as the prion Jacob-Creutzfeldt disease variant. And it's about to peak again in the next 10 years. So we began looking at the cost of industrial farming, the wider political context, and of course, you're talking foot and mouth, avian flu, H1N1, H5N1, coming down from Mount Helena this morning in the car with my sister, our program on the radio about avian flu. They're now really, really concerned that it's going to come back in a big way. And of course, it's now jumping. They now know it's going to jump into the human. So pandemics, foot and mouth, avian flu, BSE, all evidence of the wrong agricultural policy. So what is to be the response? Well, we did a documentation project of the 2001 foot and mouth documentation. We persuaded the Arts Council to release some money, £60,000, but we employed artists and writers, and we documented the whole thing. It was the first cultural documentation of a pandemic ever. And we are now very interested in this idea of a cultural response to pandemics. So out of agriculture in the rural comes another understanding. By about 2002, we still weren't too certain where we were going, but we were responding to one crisis after another. It was no longer an intellectual, academic, artistic sort of journey of let's explore agriculture. There might be a problem. The problems were proliferating faster than we could deal with them. Social suicides on farms, and the list of the issues. So we began running some exploratory conferences. Fiona will remember this one. And eventually, after doing a few test cases, the Arts Council came back to us. So after we were badgering the Arts Council, we were saying, look, there is a serious problem. We need to look at formulating an arts and cultural sector response to the problems in the rural sector and the notion of an agricultural crisis. This was the first meeting at the Arts Council. And what was interesting, we brought together for the first time Department of Culture and Arts Council policymakers with farming and rural leaders. At the end of the meeting, it was quite successful. That's the head of the Arts Council's policy division, just to the right there underneath the statue. And the guy in the blue shirt is the leader of the Small Farmers Organisation, and the lady in blue is Celia, who's my project called. Out of that, at the end of the meeting, the Arts Council people said, after the farmers are gone, Ian, it was really, really interesting. And I'm thinking, they've engaged with the intellectual problem. They said, no, all those different regional accents. They were from Cornwall, and they were from... Anyway, to cut a long story short, the Arts Council said, okay, funding for 2 years to produce a strategy document allowing the Arts Council to look at these issues in more depth. That's the new Rural Arts Strategy. It's on our website, literal.org.uk, which I'll give you at the end. 40-page document, the best thing ever produced. The Arts Council chucked it into the bin. I'll explain why later. Basically, the recommendations of the new Rural Arts Report, and I'll let you read it because... and the main reason why I'm here, and the main reason why I very much support and endorse what Marco and his colleagues are doing at IASCA, is they're pioneering a new cultural field which has aesthetic, ethical, and political issues which I think are central, not to agriculture, but to the capacity of human beings to reproduce themselves. Agriculture is about human fertility and the biodiversity of it. It's not just an economic enterprise. When we finished the report, at this point, the Arts Council said, well, it was terribly interesting. Let's get together with the policymakers. So I got the policymakers from the Rural Department and the Agriculture Department together with the policy officials in the Department of Culture. They'd never met each other. This is Whitehall. I mean, it's across the street, for God's sake. And they said, okay, look, intellectually we accept your arguments, but it's got to make economic sense. And this is where I invited Marco to our first conference. So we began looking at this concept of a creative rural economy. It wasn't where I wanted to go, necessarily. I'm much more interested in the critical and philosophical and policy issues. But they said, look, give us the economic arguments and we'll buy it. So I thought, well, I just borrowed from Richard Florida, organized a 3-day conference, and we began mapping out the creative rural economy. It was very interesting because through anecdotal evidence and other statistics, it transpired that farming and land-based communities were also generating cultural products. One example is Michael Eavis, a little-known dairy farmer from Somerset, who happens to run the biggest arts festival in the world, Glastonbury. He generates £90 million for the British creative economy. And it's not listed as a rural contribution. It's listed as an urban contribution. By way of contrast, Sir Nicholas Sirota recently demanded £100 million from the Arts Lottery to build yet another extension to Tate Britain. And when he said why, he said, well, the Tate generates £100 million £48,000 per annum to the creative economy. Bullshit. We've received £48,000 in 5 years from the Arts Council for our work. Anyway, this is the report we did for the Arts Council. These are the recommendations. And I think the key thing here is reconnection. And I think that's a lot of what's happening in space. And just very briefly to finish off, I don't want to sort of overrun my time. Having got that far, having made the economic arguments, made the intellectual arguments, the artists were engaging with a whole range of rural issues, GMOs and all of that. Basically, I had to adopt the role of Indiana Jones, which I was quite happy to do because if you're working at government level, which I wasn't really used to, avoiding ambitions in Whitehall, and of course fending off the vested interests in the professional and rural arts lobby, they actually won in the end. They got it defeated, jumping through policy hoops, and of course the classic one. This was when Tony Blair was in power, and of course there was lots of social inclusion and cultural diversity, arts funding. And one civil servant said to me at the end of a meeting one day, and I got a bit frustrated, he said, "Ian, you guys are just not black enough." I mean, it's not necessarily meant to be racist, but you know what I'm saying. It didn't fit their cultural... rural culture didn't fit the cultural diversity. So where is your mandate? So after about 4 years of background work, we wrote a new report, which is the Creative Rural Economies report. You can download it again. We organised... this was at the time of the election in England. And on the right-hand slide is a meeting in Parliament. We set up an all-party government committee, Liberal, Labour, and Tory. And this is the Tory Shadow Minister making a firm commitment to back the rural cultural strategy. In February 2010, he was elected 3 months later and denied ever having said it. It's politics. Anyway, so the rural cultural strategy is really the thing that we're working on. And what you've got here is a kind of the list of our arguments and the list of our proposals. And I think one of the key areas is to encourage a wider role for professional arts in engaging with rural issues and agricultural issues. Cultural equity. Actually, to be provocative, I'm not that convinced that we need artists in this sphere of work. I'm quite interested in the notion of indigenous rural creativity. And I think Michelle alluded to it and one other speaker. I mean, yes, artists are great to have along, but they're very much programmed to working in certain ways. I mean, we can argue about it later, and I talk about this in the context of art without artists. So where we are now, I go back to London on next week, and there's a high-level committee of the Department of Culture, Department of Rural Affairs, Agriculture, Arts Council, and basically we're going through this list. We've got political backing, we're talking about a new rural aesthetic, creative rural economy initiative, and an international rural biennale model. I mean, the biennale concept is largely discredited now, so I use that in inverted commas. We're looking for new models, and I think what Marco is doing here and his team and his artists and his rural community leaders and farmers are actually helping to map that out. And just to give you some examples of what we're proposing, well, shit. If the Tate can get 100 million for yet another bloody extension, we want a national gallery for agriculture and rural communities. Thank you. And, later. And of course, but what's interesting is, of course, and what you're seeing here with what the artists are offering you here is new structures, new intellectual structures, new theoretical structures, and new built structures that are part of generating this new narrative. And the narrative of agriculture is culture, culture is agriculture, and it sits at the heart of our agendas. Left-hand side, a Yugoslavian artist has been working on the dairy cow for 30 years, Radovan Kraguli, a national gallery for the dairy cow. Why not? I mean, we've got national galleries and museums coming out of our ears in England, and half of them are unviable. And the other one that interests me particularly is, nobody mentioned poor old Grantchester. The dialogical aesthetic should have slipped in at the end of a conversation there. Grantchester has really played a really important role here. And I think what you've got on the right-hand side is a meeting of the EU agricultural ministries who actually commissioned their pavilion for their meeting in a field in the Netherlands with cows and with waders and with dairy products produced. We're looking at new dialogical structures, new structures both built and theoretical through which we can negotiate these agendas. Rural Biennale, you're probably aware of Public Farm 1, the Museum of Modern Art in PS1 in New York 4 years ago, ran a very interesting urban farm project. There's urban farming projects coming out our ears everywhere. I want to mention Neil Berrickry over in New South Wales. Brian Cow, very important work. Neil is a dairy farmer, artist. He's been pioneering this work for a while. He deserves a lot more recognition. He's really important. The Swedish group, Cultivator, created a wedding of art and agriculture about a year ago and invited the Swedish Agriculture and Culture Ministries. It's beginning to happen. Right-hand side, vertical farming. The city remembers its origins in agriculture. The city remembers its rural origins. And finally, just to close off, is really this is the key propositions as I see it. This is why I think space is really, really important. And indeed, WA is leading the field in this work. Its artists and its curators. And I leave you with this image of Agnes Dennis on the bottom right-hand side. That's her wheat field shortly before it was harvested. Do you know the story? Terrific. And of course, she harvested the wheat. A local Italian restaurant made bread, and they took the bread as part of a banquet to the brokers in Wall Street who were basically gambling with agricultural futures. It goes a full. What an extraordinary project. And finally, I haven't really been able to talk about deep practice or the durational aesthetic. That's for another time. But it comes out of this agricultural work. Really, where we are now, Littoral and my colleagues in England, we're really looking at 4 future areas. Art and agriculture, a cultural strategy for agricultural change, intervening in EU agricultural policy. Culture artists can intervene in rural and agricultural policy. We have an obligation to do that. Art and pandemics, I think it's the next big thing. And it's not scaremongering, I think, looking at a cultural response to pandemics, not because of farming, because it's embedded in our culture. Thirdly, I mentioned the Arts Council ditching the report. Art bureaucracies do that. They're basically conservative. And I would say some artists are conservative and many curators are conservative. However, what we've faced with in England as a result of our work is the Arts Council ditched the work and basically tried to suppress it. I won't go into the details now. So we've decided we need a new type of arts council. So one of our other projects is to come up with an alternative arts council that might be a bit more responsive to environmental, ecological, social and political issues. And of course, it's all about sustainable cultures. Thank you very much.